So, welcome to this first video on a series in integrated strategy execution. What we're going to consider today is why do organizations struggle with execution? This is a really interesting question. I mean, at the moment, my understanding from the last HBR review I read was about 70% of organizations freely admit that they're failing to execute. I mean, from a Ram study, I believe execution or failure to execute is the number one reason for CEO turnover in the Global 5000. It's also clearly one of the top priority items, as the conference room board survey every year says, from the CEOs that survey, yep, we really need to be better at execution. So it's paradoxical. Why is it then, with that kind of context, why do organizations struggle with execution? My contention is that the challenge really is, it goes a bit like this. If you think about the annual planning cycle in most traditional organizations, budget-driven organizations, what you have is kind of towards the end of Q2, you have effectively an off-site strategy day. This is where the senior leaders of the organization get together, effectively to go through and understand what the big picture version of the organization is. And it's all well and good, and absolutely to consider, the challenges, the external environment, what's, strengths and weaknesses, the market, and they come together and they kind of identify where does the organization need to go. The challenge with that is that often it comes back with some intent, but it's not well formed. So often they come back and there's an exercise that follows it. This is up in the ivory tower where the senior executives are getting together and they're effectively, developing. There's the CEO there talking his PowerPoint, and effectively a team around the table developing out that strategy. And again, the planning level that they're at here is such a high level that there hasn't been the consideration of, do we have the resources to do this? What kind of effort is going to be required from all the different constituents? Do we have the capabilities? All the things that will make it actually feasible to execute. So what typically happens on the back of this is that each of the functional leads will go away and further develop their functional plan. Okay, what do we expect our revenue is going to be? What are the capabilities that we need to develop, etc., etc. And this will involve the team that's related to that particular function. But in my experience, this process typically takes, if this is kind of Q2, this is into late Q2, early Q3, this is going into towards the end of Q3, and it rolls on from there. What's happening is around about the same time, the finance team are quite reasonably calling for, okay, but we need a financial plan for the business. We need to create a budget. So what typically happens, and I call it the big W of budgeting, effectively what you see is, hey, give me the numbers, and this process is more of a bottom-up. Give me the numbers. What you happen is each of the members of different departments in the organization, different organizational cost and profit centers, are asked to make some kind of forecast of what they're expected to spend in the next year. And as we know, most of this is driver-based. What we expect to spend in resources is often a function of the revenue we expect to drive. But what actually happens in practice is that the contribution that they make, the component which is about the discretionary strategic expenditure, that bit is very much influenced by the local priorities and less by the strategy. Of course, there is some influence from this off-site work or even from the sort of high-level planning that's done, but this is happening way before this is well developed. So what people are doing, and obviously you know how the budget kind of psychology works, people are saying if I need to include, for example, some contingency here, because I know, effectively if I don't include that contingency, what's going to happen? Well, what happens is when I get here, the number is so big, everybody's, whoa, slow down, got to cut this effectively by, cut by X percent, wherever it's 25% or whatever it happens to be that they're cutting. And now that's not a particularly scientific process, but it tends to lead to a process where people go, okay, well I really need to keep this in, because if I don't use it, it's going to end up that I'm going to lose it, so I got to make sure I know, and that whole kind of game theory concept leads to, maybe something that's close enough for military work. Essentially, out from this comes a budget. But, critically, this budget effectively represents some decisions about the reallocation of resources. And this process is often completed and needs to be completed so that the top management, the CEO, the CFO, can go out and talk to the analysts and talk about what their plan is for the end of the year, and also at that point in time they often have to write in fairly degree in stone what their plan is for the following year in terms of budgetary promises. And this ultimately quickly becomes a commitment, including the constraints that that budget defines in terms of resources. Now that is a process, and obviously it's necessary because we have to end up with a plan for execution, at least at a financial level. But the challenge is that, as we're developing this plan and we're starting to identify the various initiatives, there is inevitably a disconnect. Effectively, if I put in here a disconnect, that disconnect is between the resources that we've allocated and the way we've allocated those, and the important initiatives that are falling out from the functional strategies. Now again, part of the problem here is this is not a particularly precise science. The level of planning detail this comes into is not as systematic as we potentially would like, and it's further complicated by the fact, as we move into Q4 and possibly even into Q1 in many organizations, what you end up with is that the cascade of the objectives of the organization from this top level to the different members of the leadership team, and then through the different organizational units and the functions and the group service functions, all those things. As we go down through the organization and we're identifying against each person's personal development reviews or their objectives, you identify initiatives that they want to do. These initiatives of how they're going to achieve those objectives. But again, we have this disconnect between the budget. And more concerningly, the process here, there's a significant opportunity, particularly since most of this is done on a one-to-one basis behind closed doors, there's a significant opportunity for translation problems. Often I've seen, and I've had exposure myself, is if you put the objectives of an organization up on the wall and you brought everybody's PDRs together and you looked at that and you try to draw the lines, I bet you very quickly, within a couple of levels of deployment, the red thread that connects this stuff is very difficult to understand. You put people with different objectives that are almost diagrammatically opposite to the ones for their peers. Now, putting all that together, when you actually think about execution now, you've got a bunch of people who've got certain goals they're trying to drive. They've developed projects and plans that they haven't got a consistent view of what they need to do, because it's driven both from the deployment of the goals and from the functional planning. And ultimately, there's a significant disconnect between the allocation of resources and those projects. And then give a couple of months of time to happen, and the only thing they can measure against in the early part of the following year is the financial lagging indicators, the revenue, the profit, the performance, the operational performance numbers that are related to the budget. And you tend to get the behavior, particularly when people's rewards and recognition is tied to budgetary numbers, you tend to get a behavior that says, this is king, and this is kind of something we look at, but becomes less and less interesting as we go through the year, and this is really the plan we're executing, because ultimately what we're investing in represents the strategy of the company. And the problem is that, ultimately we get back into this process where every year we take this folder off the shelf that we've nicely put for the strategy, and we say, hey, that's the input to the next offsite, but why did we not make the progress we expected to make? So that's the challenge. This is why I believe traditional organizations struggle with execution. And in our next video, we'll look at how we can actually attempt to solve this problem, what some of the better strategies might be. Thanks a lot.